This is an amazing Conversations with Christians Engaged. Of our 50 plus episodes, I am probably more excited about this episode as we introduce our Christians Engaged book club selection for November, because I have Frances FitzGerald with me. Now, you might not have ever heard of Frances FitzGerald, who's affectionately known as Frankie, but I want to tell you about the impact of the book that we're going to read in November, The Evangelicals. This book, which I'm going to show for those of you who are watching us on video, was really the genesis of what we're doing with Christians Engaged. If you've heard about or connected with Christians Engaged around America, it's because this book really impacted my life. After my congressional race for Congress in 2018, my doctor said I had to go on a silent fast because I had messed up my vocal cords. Now, can you imagine going on a silent fast? It was hard. Well, I picked up my Bible on my desk, and I picked up this book that was on my shelf. I was just talking to Frances about how I don't remember when I bought it, but sometimes we buy books and we don't pick them up until later, and that's what happened. And I read this book, and it really just created a heart cry in my heart of, God, what is my place as someone who has a political science degree and someone who has a theology degree in this space to impact America? This book, The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America, gives the history of the evangelical church through the first Great Awakening all the way through the Trump presidency. So I'm excited to have Frances here. She is a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Ben Croft Prize, among others. She's the author of one of her famous books is Fire in the Lake, America Revised, about Vietnam. She's got a book called Cities on a Hill, Way Out There on the Blue. There's a lot of great books that she's written. She lives in New York and Maine with her husband, James, and we are thrilled to have you, Frankie.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for talking about this book. As I just said, this book really just changed everything for me. Why did you write it? What was your motivation to write a whole book, one volume, on the evangelicals' impact on politics?
Well, I've been writing about evangelicals for a long time. And I was teaching in Lynchburg, Virginia, when Jerry Falwell started in his sort of the presidential campaign of 1980. And I never heard of him, nor had my editors or anybody else I knew in New York. So I wrote a piece about him for the New Yorker, and it wasn't really about him. It was about what it's like to live in a fundamentalist community, and then I added on a bit about his new political activities, but. It wasn't really a political piece at all. It was a little more sociological, if you will.
So you became fascinated with what these crazy evangelicals believe and how they were using their faith to impact their communities. So, I mean, you must have really got into it at that point to write a whole book, because this book, how long did this book take to write?
Well, I'd written quite a few other pieces about different pastors here and there, and so actually I'd done a lot of research before starting the book proper, and so but I felt that, having done all this work, I should do a complete book on it, because I was sort of ready to, and it took probably about 5 years.
Wow. Well, it's an amazing accomplishment. I felt like I was a kid trying to get through Gone with the Wind in 3 days. I remember as a kid staying up all night, eating cheese sandwiches, trying to get through Gone with the Wind. That's how I felt with this book. I could not put it down, and I really didn't want to sleep. It's kind of like getting immersed in the whole history at one moment was such a great impact on my life. But let's talk first. Let's define evangelicals for people. How do you define evangelicals?
Well, I think there's a sort of orthodox way of doing it, which is that evangelicals are different from other groups, other Christian groups, in that they first of all are born again, and then that the Bible is really the center of everything, and then they proselytization is an important point. I mean, is sharing the faith with others is very important.
Yes,
which it is not with some other Christian groups, and that's probably the three most important things. But a lot of people don't, sort of go through this list. They just feel themselves to be evangelical. They feel that they have a closer communion with God than they did in other churches.
so for the most part, it's someone understanding that it's not just church attendance, but that the Lord should impact all of their life.
Right.
Would you say that's correct?
I would say, and you would hope that was the case.
You'd hope that was the case everywhere. A lot of people don't understand how diverse the Christian faith is. We're very diverse as a people, and that's constantly changing in our world. But we saw that I was fascinated by the beginning during the First Great Awakening, the diversity of the different groups and the competition even back then. Through your research, what were some of the things that stuck out to you of that beginning first period in the First Great Awakening?
Well, first of all, it accompanied the American move west. And before that, in the days of Puritans, for example, it was very Calvinist in the United States. And when people began moving out, the church kind of exploded. And all kinds of new preachers came in who believed that strict 5-point Calvinism was not going to do much for people on the frontiers who perhaps didn't read very well or certainly hadn't studied their Bible very well, and so the whole theology became simplified. And the idea was that you first become born again, and then after that you start practicing and studying and that kind of thing, as opposed to going through the whole ritual to get into the church in the first place. But it really started, with Jonathan Edwards, who was perhaps one of the major Calvinist preachers of the time. And he had a vision, that's all, and of Christ when he was outdoors in the middle of the fields, and he could just feel the presence of Christ. And I think he wanted other people to feel that too. I mean, he preached to his own congregation in a very strict fashion, but soon many other people started joining him, because he was talking about the ills of his particular society, and because he was opening the doors to salvation for anybody. And that was really important point, because for Calvinists, certainly at the time, you were predestined to go to heaven or hell. And this was sort of an unattractive idea to many people. So he was preaching that even if you had sinned, even if you were not predestined, you could go to heaven
You can choose.
if you believed.
So even in the first Great Awakenings, there's this diversity of thought of how do we even come to God? We couldn't even get that completely right as far as agreement, but we really saw the emergence of people, like you said, bringing people to faith. Jonathan Edwards' messages being a great point that drove hundreds and thousands of people to the Lord in that season. Now, in the Civil War period, I love this part of your book where you talked about all the things that were happening. I mean, we saw from the North to the South different theological aspects of the church, but how did evangelicals during that season handle the conflicts surrounding slavery and social ills? And I know that's a huge topic. So just bite off a little bit of that apple for me.
Well, in the North, there was a large section of the evangelical population, which was by then most people were evangelical by then, that were actively anti-slavery. And there were some very famous figures, Timothy Dwight and so forth, who created a real pressure group in Washington by collecting signatures, really. And the denominational heads of the Methodist Church, which was very big then, and the Baptist Church, came to sort of blows over this. Not physically, but the Southerners did not like the anti-slavery part of it at all. So that those two denominations split in half, Northern and Southern, and the Southern, the Baptists never got back together again.
Wow. So they got divided over these moments, and denominations split, and they kept going. But I loved how you said they got petitions, they started engaging with their government, they realized that their faith should impact the way they even responded to the social ills of the day, correct?
Correct. And the Southern Baptists always said that, that spirituality and politics were two different things. But in practice, they too influenced their governments, state governments. About the blue laws, for example, were evangelical in nature, and there were other. They were very important as a cultural force in the South, and I think they became even more important after the Civil War as a cultural force in the South.
So, even in the beginning of modern America, we saw hospitals and educational institutions and all those created by, really the church, for lack of a better word. Would you define those movements as evangelicals or just the religious community at large?
Well, there were different religious communities had their own hospitals, their own social service programs, and so on. But the evangelicals did too, and since they were a large part of the Protestant communion, they were very important in this, and they didn't begin the common school movement, the public school movement, but they enthusiastically endorsed it afterwards.
Wow, that's great. So you have a chapter where you start talking about Billy Graham and modern evangelicalism, talking about that time period and what modern evangelism then looked like. Billy Graham did shift in the minds of a lot of people, for good or bad, what they consider evangelism to look like because of his talent and his abilities and just the way he could draw a crowd and bring people to a decision, for lack of a better word, that they were going to receive Jesus or not. How do you think he impacted, even today, what we see in the church?
Well, let me go backwards a tiny bit
Sure.
to the beginning of the 20th century, when essentially nobody was known as an evangelical because all Protestants were assumed to be evangelical. So the word was hardly used at all, and you were either a fundamentalist or a liberal. And essentially the liberals won in terms of the established churches, and so the evangelicals became preachers often became people on the road, and that's how Graham started out with evangelizing the military and people around them. So he had a very dynamic style at first, you might say. Perhaps you go further than that and say that it was, sort of blood and thunder. He began as on the anti-communist theme in the 50s, and then gradually he broadened out, and he wanted actually to include not just the people he didn't want just fundamentalists with him. He felt they were too narrow, and also he disagreed with them about slavery or segregation at that point. So he began reaching out to the Episcopalian Church, the Northern Baptist Church, and so forth, and he sort of rather deliberately turned off the major fundamentalist leaders at the time, and so he was trying to create a middle way between. He wasn't a liberal, and he didn't want to be a fundamentalist, so he took up the word evangelical again, which started to mean something rather else than it had in the 19th century. Not entirely else, but it really was his definition of it more than anything else that prevailed. And he was an extraordinary speaker. I mean, you should have heard his voice. I heard him a couple of times. It's a great, deep baritone, sort of bronze voice. And he was no longer, when I heard him in the 60s, preaching sort of militant anti-communism or anti-anything. He was trying to bring people to Christ. And on both occasions, there were thousands of people listening to him in stadiums and so forth. It was very impressive. I hadn't seen that before.
I wish I had gotten to see Billy Graham live. Unfortunately, I've just seen him on TV, but a lot of people, I got more questions when I was running for Congress about my name than I got about my public policy positions, because my name is Bunny, and that's my real name. And my dad named me after Billy Graham's daughter, Ruth Graham Bell, who is nicknamed Bunny because he came to faith watching Billy Graham on TV when he was in the Army in the late 60s. So he definitely had an impact on our family, and I know many people. And I loved how you talked about, really, he cut down to the simpleness of the message of Christ, and I think that's what attracted a lot of people to him. It wasn't so complicated.
Well, it also wasn't anti-intellectual, at that point. It wasn't in the beginning, but later it was less so. I mean, he didn't preach complicated subjects very much, but he didn't, as I say, he wasn't anti things. He was for things.
Yes, I love that. Well, and then we go into the 80s and 90s, and we see, as you were talking about Jerry Falwell, we saw this rise of what we call the Christian right during the Reagan Revolution and the Christian Coalition, and really the redefinition politically. A lot of us in the political movement see as the redefinition of the Republican Party, where all these social conservatives, Christian leaders became very active in the party and changed actually the party platform of the Republican Party to be very much more Christian than it was before. I was fascinated by that. How do you think evangelicals became such a force in that season?
Well, I think it was first of all they were expanding their numbers at that time, or at least as far as we knew, because we had no polling before Gallup in 1950.
So the church itself was expanding, or the people that were evangelicals were expanding, not even in political
and also
world.
The South, which had been very defensive and sort of somewhat cut off from the rest of the country, became a part of the country, and so evangelicals were always very important in the South. So that was part of it. Then Graham himself, made evangelicalism a thing. He brought together groups of people. Some of them were immigrant groups, the Swedish Baptist, Swedish, or so forth, into a whole thing called evangelicalism, and started the magazine Christianity Today, and created this movement, which was for its time rather liberal compared to the fundamentalist groups.
So they started uniting even though they completely didn't agree with everybody on every single point of doctrine within the denominations, they started uniting. And do you think they started uniting for a political purpose, or just to be able to have those conversations within the Christian faith? Do you think it was both?
Well, at first it was much more about uniting Christians, and I think with Falwell things changed. It changed before in small parts of the country, but Falwell made a name for himself as a national figure, and reporters rushed around trying to figure out what evangelicalism was and so forth. But I think that as time went on, the evangelical, first of all, as I said before, that the evangelicals turned the Republican Party more evangelical in the sense that they were, I don't know, a third of the vote, for George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, and so they were an important group, and Republican Party, which had never been anti-abortion, for example, started taking up all the social messages of evangelicalism. But then I think later, much later, around the time of Obama, and so on, what you might say is the Republican right, which was always quasi-Christian, became much more secular. If you look at what goes on today, you'll find that religious people are more attuned with the secular policies of the Republican Party, but they've also changed it so that their own input is still there. So we have what we've never had before, really, in the United States, which is a quasi-religious party.
Wow. So the difference in your mind between, say, George W. Bush acceptance of the Christian right in 2000 and 2004, that was a large part of his election, to the Trump election in 2016. So spell that out a little more, how you think that kind of became redefined.
Well, I was talking before about his father, Bush the father.
Herbert Walker, yeah.
Whereas Bush the son was an evangelical himself. And I think that he did a great deal just through rhetoric to bring more evangelicals into the Republican fold. And he turned Republicans even more towards the evangelical social message, and the big issue there was gay marriage, and
yes,
yeah. So and that sort of tipped the scales, I think, a bit, and at this point, I think, I don't know, it's something like 70 or 80% of evangelicals vote Republican, and they make up about half of the Republican Party or more. So in a way, the two have become one, and the evangelicals are not just for the usual evangelical program, but also for the Republican one.
So you think a lot of the maybe what would consider evangelical issues of pro-life, traditional marriage, some of what we consider the social issues, then got merged with some of the other Republican Party in their platform, in their minds, where that just becomes one thought. I'm diving into that with you a little bit because that's fascinating.
Well, for example, the Tea Party movement was not started by evangelicals at all, and it was right. Essentially an issue about taxes, and they want smaller government and so forth. But very quickly it became full of evangelicals, and it turned out that lower taxes and smaller government was a part of what, for example, Jerry Falwell advocated, and he didn't invent it himself. There were many fundamentalists before that who were certainly a part of that movement. So it was a natural fit.
That's fascinating as a historian for you to kind of bridge that gap, because in my mind, I think about people just kind of woke up that the Bible had a lot to say about debt and taxation and different things. But I can see where that looks like it's just kind of aligning. But yeah, it's interesting to see. And this is off topic, but I mean, do you think the evangelicals have had any impact on the Democratic Party? Or what's the relationship that you've seen there? I would just, out of curiosity.
Well, they haven't really, because since they became political, they either joined the Southern Democratic Party while it was still very conservative, and then they turned Republican when the Democrats became liberals, and so they really have never had any position or influence on the sort of modern Democrats.
Do you think the defining issue was abortion on that? Do you think that was the defining issue?
I'm not sure it was.
Okay.
I think it was important as a talking point,
Mm.
but there were plenty of other issues that both sides would agree on. As I say, less government and lower taxes as well. But it's not that all evangelicals agreed about that, but they've come to ally themselves with the Republican Party such degree because that's the way they think that they will preserve a Christian America, that they will um, uh, be powerful enough to stave off what they think of as, the intrusion of immigrants and um, non-evangelicals into the United States. So um, they have relied on the Republican Party to do that for them, which of course they have. And so you will find the Democrats almost always on the other side of those issues.
That's really fascinating. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Okay, so before we let you go, we gotta talk about 2026, 2016 and 2020, because I am absolutely fascinated on your opinion on Trump. So we know that these constitutionally minded religious folks definitely had an impact in 2016 to see Trump elected. What happened in 2020 in your mind? I mean, I'm really curious on your opinion on that. Do you think that they came down as a defining force and they just didn't have as much influence, or more secular people showed up, or what do you think happened in 2020, 2016 and 2020?
Normally, what happens is people don't vote if they're not keen on the party they support. They wouldn't support the other side, but they simply would stay home. And whereas there was a considerable fuss over whether the evangelicals ought to join the Trump campaign. I mean, in the primaries, many had voted against him, and some of the major leaders of the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, um, were very much against Trump. But gradually, when it seemed that he was going to be the nominee and he was going to take power, they all sort of fell in line behind him. Not all, but most, and they had to stick that way. But then it depended whether they were keen or not on him, and if they weren't so keen, they just didn't vote.
Wow. So part of it could be they just didn't vote in
Yeah,
2020.
yeah,
Yeah. Or we cannot stomach this again. Where maybe first time it was more Hillary, an anti-Hillary sentiment, forced them to vote, and then the second time they just stayed home. That's interesting.
but not. I
Okay.
mean, not to the extent that one might think listening to this, because still 70% or whatever came out for Republicans.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. That's fascinating. Now, do you see? I want you to look into your crystal ball for a second and think about the future. As a historian, having studied all of this history, do you think this political fervor within evangelicals is going to die down with an older generation of Christian leaders, or do you see movements rising that will engage the next generation? Do you think this is going to keep going, or do you think it's going to slow down?
Well, to me, it's the evangelical as a political group have been very much splintered. There hasn't been one major leader really since Pat Robertson, and but nonetheless they continue voting Republican. They continue. Um, uh, uh, Even in school board elections, that kind of thing, they make an effort, and often they mobilize themselves just as well as Robertson mobilized them. So I think they'll go on. But the question is how keen they're going to be on the candidates that they see in front of them, and that if it'd be interesting if Trump runs again, because we'll the other half of the country, or the other 3/4 of the country are so anti-Trump at this moment. But if evangelicals see that, or what they consider the sort of amoral, godless Democrats as the alternative, they'll vote for Trump.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting what the next few years holds, but I definitely see a rise in evangelicalism as a whole in our nation, even though it looks like, we're living in a post-Christian world, that I think fervent faith believers are going to continue to rise up and speak out, and where they engage politically is a whole nother story. Depending on where we define as what's important to our families. But this has been fascinating, Frankie. I am so thankful for you and this book. So you guys all need to get the Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America. Now, this is a heavy read. Again, 600 something pages. But I'm telling you, the more you can read this in a week or 2 weeks and really get the picture of America, I think it's fascinating for all of us to understand. And for me, it's been a prayer to see myself in that history book. Where do I fit in that history? What is my part to play? And to seek the Lord about what that looks like. Not everybody is called to political activity. Not everybody is called to be a Jerry Falwell or a Billy Graham, but we all have a responsibility to pray, to vote, and to engage wherever we are called to. So, Frankie, thank you so much for this history. We lose our understanding because we don't understand the history. Wherever we fall in this partisan lines, it's important for us to know where people of faith have kind of gone and where we're kind of going. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, guys. Pick up the Evangelicals and read it with our book club this month. And then the final Friday of November, we'll be discussing the book. I will pull out all my notes and be looking through all my favorite parts. So you guys join us on an open Zoom call the last Friday of November. You can register at our book club page at christiansengaged.org. So we'll see you soon. Grab the book and share this interview with Frankie with your friends and family. Okay? Thank you so much.